Hello, everybody, and welcome to VATSIM's Cross the Pond 2024 Eastbound Pilot Briefing webinar presented by us here at Flight Simulation Association in cooperation with our friends at Slant Alpha Adventures, VATSIM, the Pilot Club, and the Cross the Pond team. My name is Evan. I'm one of the co-founders of Flight Simulation Association, also one of the folks who put on Flight Sim Expo. Proud VATSIM controller, represent Boston ARTCC. Excited for Cross the Pond happening on Saturday. We are back once again here to share with you everything you need to know about this year's event. If you are new to VATSIM, if you are new to Cross the Pond, if you are an experienced flight simmer who's done all of this before, we hope that each and every one of you will take at least something from today's session. We are live in a whole bunch of places, including on the Flight Sim Association website, YouTube, on Slant Alpha Adventures on Twitch, with the Pilot Club on YouTube, with VATSIM on YouTube. I am keeping an eye on the Cross the Pond Discord. There is a question called Pilot Briefing Q&A, so feel free if you have questions or you just want to say hi. That's a great place to do so. I will be keeping an eye on that and trying to respond to as many questions as I can as we get going. We've got about 5-10 minutes before we bring on some of our VATSIM experts and we actually start to dive into the material. So if you're looking to stretch your legs or grab a drink, now would be a perfectly good time to do that, especially if you already know a lot about Cross the Pond and VATSIM, because I'm going to spend the next 5-10 minutes just talking a little bit more about what this is and providing some background for the people who maybe it's your first event, maybe you've never flown on VATSIM before, and I'll share just a little bit more about what all of those details are before we actually dive in and get started with the main content today. So starting off, I do want to say we're grateful to have a number of people supporting us today, including our friends over at the Pilot Club. And if you're somebody who's new to VATSIM, you're looking for some training, joining a virtual airline, group flights, fun activities, that's one of many great places that help support pilot education on the network. All of our friends watching us at the Pilot Club, Serge, thank you so much for helping to support our educational efforts and share this content with as many VATSIMers as we can. And if you're interested at all in learning more about them, thepilotclub.org is their website, and you can scan that little QR code that you see on the screen to learn a little bit more about what they do and how they help support pilot education on the network. So for those of you who don't know, let me start with what the heck VATSIM is. If you've never heard of VATSIM or you are new to online flying, VATSIM is one of the world's largest online air traffic control communities. It's worldwide. It's totally free. You download a piece of software, you connect your flight simulator to the network, you can see other pilots, you can talk to other pilots, and you can talk to volunteer air traffic controllers. On an evening, you might see 1,500 or 2,000 people on a busy night connected to the network all across the world, and you'll see controllers coming online and offline because they're volunteers and they do it when works for them. But Cross the Pond is something special. It's one of VATSIM's biggest events, and during Cross the Pond, we will see air traffic control specifically staffed for pilots to fly all the way across the ocean, 8, 9, 10-hour flights with full ATC coverage all the way. This year's event that's coming up on Saturday is an eastbound event. So we did the westbound edition in April. We're now doing the eastbound edition where pilots will start on the western side of the Atlantic in North America and in South America, fly over the ocean, and then they'll be landing in Europe and Africa several hours later. And again, air traffic control is set up to support all this. So you will see full ATC coverage across the ocean throughout the entirety of Cross the Pond afternoon. That is on Saturday, October the 19th, so just in a couple of days from now, obviously. And I want to talk about a couple of important things that people who may not have heard about this event before or maybe have heard about it and seen it need to know. One of the biggest things is this: you have to, absolutely have to have a slot to fly across the ocean and to fly in this event. So this is not a free-for-all, decide to join us on Saturday. You have to have planned out being part of this event. If you go back about 5 years, the event was a free-for-all and it was just nuts. I remember controlling it. You could sometimes go through a whole air traffic controller sector and not even be able to get a word in because the frequencies were just ridiculous. And so we really rethought this event and did a great job of clamping down on how many people were allowed to participate. Yes, it means that not everyone gets to participate every single year, but it also means we've made the event a much more enjoyable experience for those who do get to participate. So I was told that I wasn't clear enough about this last year, so on behalf of the entire VATSIM team and the supervisors and the Cross the Pond team, I guess I have to be the one who says this, but please, if you do not have a slot, do not fly across the pond on Saturday. You can do all kinds of other things. You can fly anywhere else that air traffic control is online. You can fly out of the departure airports or into the departure airports on the western side of the Atlantic, but please do not fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and please do not fly into any of the cross the pond arrival airports. The air traffic control there is staffed specifically for cross the pond, and that is the reason that we are doing it like this. So it's really important that folks understand that and really focus on just flying if they have a slot time. Now, if you are someone who has a slotted departure already, you need to confirm that slot. If you haven't done that already, then there is a chance that you'd lose it. So make sure you check on all those details. I will also say that on October 17th, so that's tomorrow at about 17 Zulu, then you'll need to understand as well that if you don't have a slot, you do have an opportunity to potentially get that slot. And if anything from someone who hasn't necessarily gotten a slot already, you'll be able to pick that up if they are lost. So anyone who hasn't confirmed their slot, basically what I would say is on the 17 Zulu time on October the 17th, you'll have a good opportunity to potentially pick up a slot time. And I'll say also that for those of you who do have a slot in your pilot dashboard, that's where you have everything you need to know from pilot briefing information to routes and all of those details. So that's a little bit more on how that all works. That was a bit of introduction, so let me just pause for 1 second to click one button that I need to click here, and we'll continue on in just a second. And hello again for those of you who didn't hear the first portion of that. We're back, and now you can see me, and now you can hear me. So welcome. We are here talking about VATSIM's Cross the Pond. That is one of the biggest and busiest VATSIM events of the year. We expect to have thousands of pilots and air traffic controllers connected to the network this Saturday. That is October the 19th. A couple of really important things that I'll mention for those of you who are new to VATSIM, new to this whole experience. First of all, you absolutely need a slot to participate in Cross the Pond. So if you don't have one yet, there is possibly an opportunity tomorrow. That's October the 17th. And that slot time, basically what's going to happen is if folks who had a slot didn't necessarily confirm theirs, those may drop into open. And that will happen around 1700 Zulu. So if you don't have a slot time and you do want to fly across the pond, that's a good time to check back on the Cross the Pond booking website. That's at ctp.vatsim.net. And other than that, if you don't have a slot, we are really asking everybody to please, please, please do not fly across the pond. You can participate on the network. You can fly anywhere else in the world. Usually there are a lot of controllers who are on in other places that aren't the cross the pond airports that would just love to have some traffic. So please allow those who have a booking this year to participate in Cross the Pond and enjoy that experience. And for those of you who do not have a slot this year, there's lots of other great ways you can participate, but we're asking you not to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and we're also asking you to please not fly into any of the cross the pond arrival airports. Other couple of important points. The purpose of this event is to simulate present day realistic transatlantic operations. So flying a modern reasonable jetliner that you know how to fly really well. That is the goal for this event. That means the Concorde, historical aircraft that aren't capable of flying over the ocean, those are airplanes that we should save for a different day. To make this event work, we need the cooperation of pilots from across the network flying aircraft that work well in this environment. So please help us out by doing that. I can tell you if you do decide to fly a Concorde or something else that isn't regular jet aircraft like a 777 or an A350, if you're trying to fly that, you will be put onto a different route at a lower altitude, and you will probably not get air traffic control coverage. And that applies to anybody who doesn't have a slot time either. So it's really important for all of us to make this event work that you please fly an aircraft type that works within the cross the pond world that we are trying to establish here on the network for this event. So that's a quick intro into Cross the Pond. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're here doing today. This session is designed for reasonably experienced VATSIM pilots who have spent some time on the network. You may have never flown in Europe. You may have never flown in North America. You probably have never flown across the ocean if this is your first event with air traffic control, but you've been on the network, so you kind of get how this actually goes. So during today's session, what we're talking about is basically to give you a better understanding of departure procedures out of mostly North America, but also anywhere on the western side of the Atlantic, to talk about how we're going to get you across the ocean, to share tips and best practices for arrivals into ICAO airspace, including both Europe and Africa, and give you access to additional resources, and of course, to help you prepare for Cross the Pond, which is now coming up this weekend. I'm going to talk a lot today. We're going to be joined by a couple of experts as well to walk through everything that you need to know, but I want to share that everything that we are going to cover is also covered in the pilot briefing documents that you can access for your airport pair and for oceanic airspace. So if you have a slot in your pilot dashboard, you will see eventually your route and times, but you will also see access to a briefing document for the departure airport, for oceanic procedures, and your arrival airport. And these are documents you should be intimately familiar with. Spend a lot of time reviewing that departure document before Saturday, and then as you're getting airborne and into the en route environment, and you have 10 hours with no idea what you want to do with those 10 hours, that's the time for you to go ahead and read through the oceanic procedures and the arrival procedures so you're really, really familiar with those. Skim them, of course, beforehand and make sure you get all those pieces together like scenery and anything else, but by all means, feel free to spend some time reviewing that as we get going. And as I said before, we'll be answering your questions live, probably right around the top of the hour after we finish the main briefing portion of today's session. You can share your questions on the Flight Sim Association website. On the Cross the Pond Discord, there is a specific channel. It is called Pilot Briefing Q&A, so feel free to post your questions there. A couple questions I will answer right now, and you can also post your questions both during and after today's session on that Cross the Pond Discord, which may be found at ctp.vatsim.net/discord. Couple of quick questions that I want to handle just before we get started, and then I will hand things over to Rob Shearman to get us started as we talk about North American departure procedures. First of all, questions regarding where do I park my aircraft. Obviously, there will be more heavy departure aircraft at these departure airports than usual. That is something the CTP team looks at, so they actually do go and try to pick airports that have additional capacity, but we know some airports like Bradley, Hartford, and of course down in the Caribbean as well may not necessarily have the ramp capacity for what we are trying to do. So what we recommend there is pick a spot, any spot, and go with it. Even if it's not the most realistic parking location, as long as you're not on top of another aircraft, if you need to relocate yourself, that's the best way to do it. Frankly, once you get onto the ground somewhere, especially if it's at a gate, but wherever it is, the air traffic controllers will work with you. We get what's going on. It's across the pond, and we will do the best that we can. Additionally, questions about PDC and CPDLC, which will come up again a little bit in the documentation that we're about to cover. So you can expect at most airports that your clearance will probably be issued by some form of either PDC or CPDLC. And US airports, that will come as a direct message in your pilot client. Other facilities may do things differently, but you can expect to see that mostly for your initial clearance. And otherwise, we will generally not be seeing PDC or CPDLC capability throughout the event. Previously, we have said that Hoppy would be used. What ends up happening is there are so many people on the network, it just doesn't work. So in practice, you can expect that outside of your initial IFR clearance, most of the event will be done via voice. But remember that over the oceanic airspace, we're typically dealing with just getting an oceanic clearance, depending on where you're going through NatTrack, and we're not doing voice position reports. So there's not as much back and forth over the ocean as you might think. But in Europe and North America, you can expect that all of your clearances, your en route stuff, that will generally be issued to you via voice. And a few people have asked about different routes and how they are going to be routed. That detail will come out when the routes are finalized. Typically, it's the night before, and you'll find them in your pilot dashboard. So we're about to get started. It'll be about 45 minutes of live talk today, and then we'll go through the Q&A following that, starting with departure procedures, then looking at the ocean, and finally heading over to Europe and African operations for the arrival. We'll also share with you some checklists and resources, as well as do the live Q&A. But I do need to put the big red disclaimer, which will spin around on the slide a couple times for you. All of this is for VATSIM flight simulation purpose only. It is not for real-world navigation, and so please understand that absolutely everything that we're covering today is designed for VATSIM, applies to the network, and it really does not apply anywhere else. All right, so I have handled all of that. I am going to pass things over to my good friend Rob Sherman, who is here to talk through departure procedures in North America. Specifically, we're looking at mostly the United States and Canada in the slides, but you'll also see that most of the procedures in the Caribbean and other parts of the departure side of things will follow some of the ICAO procedures that we have talked about. So Rob, I'll pass things over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Evan. Appreciate you inviting me back for this for a, what is it, fifth or sixth time? I don't know. I lose count. um, I don't know what, if I'm the face of this event, I'm not sure why that is, but here I am, and here we go. So I'm going to help you guys cover what you need to know as you depart out of the Americas. And when I say Americas, we're talking about North and South America that have participating airports in this event. We also have some departures from the Caribbean in this particular edition. So exciting time coming up on Saturday. We're going to talk about the process for requesting clearance. We're going to cover some reminders about your initial climb, aka top altitude. We're going to give you some tips for preparing for your departure. Then we'll talk through the process of pushing back and getting a taxi, and we'll cover some differences depending on where you're departing from and how the climb instructions will go. So here we go. The very first slide here that I get to cover is called requesting clearance, and it's a bit of a misnomer because most of the time, and I think Evan mostly just covered this a few seconds ago, but we'll go over it again. Most of the time, you're not going to need to request it at all. It's just going to pop into your private message in your pilot client, whether that's vPilot or xPilot or Swift. Is going to come in the form of a text message. That is what we call a pre-departure clearance, PDC. And this is a sample of what a PDC might look like. The formatting is slightly different depending on where exactly you are receiving it from, which facility you're receiving it from. But it mostly will look something along the lines of this. And a couple of things to point out. One is that where it says squawk 7333, in some PDCs, the squawk is identified as the beacon code. So squawk, beacon, 4-digit code, same thing. Same two words that mean the exact same thing. In the remarks, you'll notice it says climb via SID, and then expect your cruise altitude 10 minutes after departure. Climb via SID is a phrase that we'll cover here in just a couple of slides. Third and final thing I'll point out in that PDC where it says contact 121.65 to push. In the US, at least, we typically say that if you're not pushing onto a taxiway, that is a non-movement area most of the time, and you can push and start at your own discretion and then call short of the nearest taxiway for your taxi instructions. However, across the pond, a little bit of a different animal in that regard. So most of your pre-departure clearances for across the pond will tell you who to contact to push. And the reason for that is that the person managing that frequency is often managing the sequence of planes departing, and they're going to try and make sure that you adhere to your slot time as closely as possible. And also sequence different departures going in different directions, alternating, so that it makes life easier for the controllers. Anyway, keep that in mind. Keep that tab open. Do not close that tab until you're airborne, because heaven forbid you get halfway through your setup and then you suddenly remember, oh, I need to call somebody to push. Who do I call? There's 4 ground controllers on. Which one do I call? Well, your PDC said so. So if you have that tab still available, you can flip back over to that and remind yourself which one it was. You don't need to read back a pre-departure clearance in the US nor in Canada. Most other places you don't. A few places you do, but for the cross the pond event, mostly you're departing from places where you don't need to respond to the PM. Just read the full message, and then your next steps will be covered in there, as we just said. The process of squawking your assigned code and flipping on your mode C or mode Charlie altitude mode is the acknowledgement of that message. If you haven't received that PDC after you've been connected for 10 minutes, that might be a good time to go ahead and contact the clearance delivery frequency. Check in with your call sign, your gate information, the ATIS letter, and your request your IFR clearance. Moving on. The IFR clearance may not include a specific departure runway. The PDC that we saw on the previous slide did not. Your departure runway might be included in the ATIS information. If you look at this one here, you will notice it says departing runway 22 right. So your ATIS information covers that piece of information. At some airports, many airports in the U.S., there are multiple departure runways in use. How will you know which of those is yours? The answer is you may not know until you're about to get your taxi instructions. So what I recommend is program in your best guess, but be ready to flip back to that departures key on your FMS and make a change to that. Just because you put it in that box doesn't mean that that's set in stone. You can always go back and change it if you get a different departure runway than the one you expected. But if there's multiple ones in the ATIS, pick your best guess and go with that, and then be adaptable if it changes. The ATIS broadcasts, a lot of times the voice doesn't come through. I find it's just often easier to double click the ATIS in your pilot client in the controller list, and then it pops up in text form. It's typically this more simple way to go about it. When we said climb via SID a few slides ago, this is what we mean by that. We mean that the SID, the standard instrument departure, will contain some climb instructions. And the most important one is what they call this top altitude. It's an initial level off altitude. When you're setting up that plane and you're dialing in your altitude into the mode control panel, this is what you want to put in there, not your cruise altitude, despite what any other tutorial might tell you, because you cannot exceed this altitude until you've been cleared to. That's how the departure controllers keep you from hitting the arrivals. So this is going to be on your SID. If it's not in your SID, your pre-departure clearance might have specified an initial altitude. Sometimes it doesn't specify an initial altitude at all, and that is a clue that you need to be looking on your SID for that initial altitude. The SID also contains a bunch of notes on it, and you want to make sure that you're reading not just the pictures, but the notes. It's like a magazine, you want to read the article too. So make sure you're paying attention to all those speed restrictions, altitude constraints, and any other special instructions. The one out of O'Hare is like notorious. It has a weird speed restriction that you don't see many other places. But anyway, read through all the notes, and there might be some interesting instructions that apply to your flight that you want to make sure you adhere to. The two main types of SIDs that you get, one is called a pilot nav SID, which the pilot literally joins the course immediately off the pavement and follows the prescribed programmed path. The other kind is called either a hybrid SID or a radar vectored SID, where the pilot maintains a certain heading or follows a certain procedure and turns to a certain heading and then is vectored to their departure path. You need to know which one yours is. How will you know that? Well, you will check the chart, and we'll cover that here in just a moment. One thing that's not listed on most departures is the semi-universal speed limit of 250 knots under 10,000 feet. You can assume that applies. However, if you across the pond tends to feature lots of very, very heavy jets loaded to near their maximum takeoff weight. So your minimum clean speed might be above 250 knots. And if that happens to be the case for you, you just want to let the controllers know for their planning purposes, if they're relying on that 250 knot speed for spacing ahead or behind, you want to let them know if you're going to be doing some other speed than that. Once you get above 10, though, it's pretty much your discretion. Now, when you're preparing for your departure, this is an example of a pilot nav SID. You want to review it carefully, paying special attention to the nodes and the speed restrictions and the altitude restraints. And you want to essentially go point by point and make sure that all of those restrictions did import properly into your FMC. You don't want to just assume that because you pulled it in and there's a list of points there and some constraints, it's probably okay. You actually do want to step through real quick during your pre-flight and make sure that all of the restrictions do indeed match. There's no typos or no discrepancies between what's on the page and what's in the box. You're responsible as the pilot in command for following what's on the page, not necessarily for following what's in the box. Another thing you can do is you can flip the flip the mode over to map mode, or plan mode rather, and you can actually kind of zoom out and inspect visually the charted path that is on your navigation display. The thing to do here, there's not only can you also see the constraints in this view if you have the data up for each point, but really just generally you want to just visually confirm, does this fishhook shaped route that I see on my left match up with the fishhook shaped route that I see on my right? Yes, it does. Okay, very good. Well, that's a good sign that things are progressing as planned. In contrast to a pilot nav departure is the Newark 5 at Newark, which is a radar vector departure. But in addition to being a radar vector departure, it's got some very, very interesting instructions. I think there's a misconception that radar vector departures always start with fly runway heading. It is not always the case. Sometimes there are other headings that you have to fly. And in the case of Newark, there's multiple headings that you have to fly up to certain distances, and then more turns that you have to make. It is not necessarily the case that your FMC is going to do all of this for you in LNAV mode. It is very, very important that you remember that you are the pilot in command. The FMC is not the pilot in command. The FMC is there to assist you, but you as the pilot get to choose how to make this work. And that could be by changing the plane into heading mode and just twisting the knob at the appropriate time. Or it could be that you actually use the U-shaped thing in front of you or the stick-shaped thing in front of you. You know, if you really want to do that, that's fine. However you get the plane to comply with the instruction is up to you. What's important is that the plane complies with the instruction. You get to be in charge of how that happens. Another note here for the Newark 5 is the top altitude is very, very low, and it's different depending on which direction they're departing. So you do want to make sure that you are not allowing the plane to climb past that top altitude until you have been cleared higher by the departure controller. And then finally, you will notice this flight plan discontinuity, and that goes back to what I said before, which is this a radar vectored SID. So you don't want to just turn toward the first programmed point on your departure path, because you need to maintain the heading that's on this chart until the departure controller can verify that that path is clear, and then they will give you the vector to join the beginning of that path, and then they'll say proceed direct blank, and then you can join that route up and proceed on your merry way. Very, very important. Radar vectored or hybrid SID. Don't turn toward that first point until you've been told to do so. Now, as I mentioned before, pushback and taxi in the U.S. at least is almost always at pilot's discretion. Pushback is not going to be at pilot's discretion for this event. You want to wait until that ramp controller or metering controller or whoever it was your PDC told you to contact tells you that it's okay to do. Now, once you've pushed, however, startup is kind of assumed. So if they didn't specifically say you're cleared to start, but you got cleared to push, you can assume you're cleared to do both. If you are told to stand by, the appropriate response is nothing. It's absolutely, you don't need to read back an instruction to stand by. You just hush. And then the other thing is take your time as you taxi, cross-reference instructions with the taxi chart or the airport diagram. It is the case. Most of the airports that we're going to be participating with will have custom scenery available for you to download. But it is the case that many airports in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 have taxiways that are just arbitrarily named. They're not actually signed and lettered by the appropriate taxiway letter. So the letters that you see on the signs are not going to match up with what you see on the chart. Well, the chart, as long as you're looking at a current chart, the current chart takes precedence, and it might be where you have to look at what's on the chart and go, okay, well, hold on. The taxiway signs are all wrong, but what it looks like here is if you've cleared me through Alpha and then Echo, well, Echo is the third left after the crossing runway, so that's where I need to turn, and so forth. But you can't just rely on the signs all the time, because the Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 scenery is just wonky like that sometimes. Last but not least on this slide, know the difference between contact and monitor. If you are told to contact the next controller, that means to switch over and check in. Southwest 120 or Boston ground, Southwest 123, short of Echo. If you're told to monitor that frequency, you switch over there and you, same thing I just said a second ago with standby, you switch over and you, because if you tell them that you're monitoring, you've destroyed the purpose of the instruction, which is to reduce frequency congestion. All right, climb instructions are a little bit different if you're in North America. I'm sorry, if you're in the US versus if you're in Canada or other places that go by ICO formatting. So let's kind of cover the differences. In Canada and in ICO land, the prevailing philosophy is that pretty much the altitude restrictions on the SID are going to apply no matter what, unless they specifically tell you to disregard them. In this first example, we've got an instruction that is that you're cleared via the dead key for departure flight planned route. And you see on this SID that it says to maintain 5,000. Well, you're thinking to yourself, well, there's a restriction up ahead that says I have to be at 6,000 or higher. So what do I do? Well, you're going to maintain 5,000 until you're then cleared higher. Okay. So you will maintain 5,000 as published. You comply with any altitude restrictions until reaching 5,000, which on this particular example, there aren't any, but then you should expect that you will get cleared higher prior to hitting that point Toronto there. Most of the time you will. The way that instruction comes is it's just going to say climb 13,000. Once you hear that, you're going to climb up to 13,000, but you do, even though it wasn't explicitly stated, you do have to assume that you have to meet these restrictions along the way. So Toronto at or above 6,000, Halifax at or below 7,000, and then Gander at exactly 10,000. And then you continue that climb up to the assigned altitude you were given, which was 13 in this case. If they want you to disregard the instructions, they will specifically say to do that. Climb unrestricted 13,000 means you climb straight up to 13,000 and you don't have to worry about any of these restrictions that were on the SID. It also means if there were speed restrictions on this SID, they are now canceled too. Unrestricted means unrestricted. Unrestricted by altitude, unrestricted by speed. So that is the way that it's explicitly going to be instructed to you. Now, contrast. We're departing from the US now. You're on a SID, and it says top altitude 10,000, and your instruction in your initial clearance was climb via SID, as we went back from that very first slide that I had. So climb via SID in this case means we're going to climb and maintain 10,000, and we're not going to go any higher until the controller clears us to. However, it does mean that we do have to hit this restriction of 5,000 or above at this first waypoint called VATSIM. We have to not exceed 7,000 by the time we hit the second waypoint, Ocean. And it means we would be level at 10,000 by the time we get to this third point, Pea Pond. I know Pea Pond makes it sound gross, but we'll just call it Pond. If they want to have you climb via the SID, but they don't want you to go all the way up to 10, the way it's said in the US is climb via SID except maintain 8,000. And in that case, these first couple of restrictions are going to apply still. You still have to be at or above 5,000 by VATSIM. You still have to not exceed 7,000 as you cross Ocean. But then you're going to continue that climb to 8,000. You're going to disregard that 10,000 at the following point, Pond, until you are cleared higher. And then they would let you know if they want you to continue to meet that restriction, because what the other instruction that you occasionally get in the US is you simply get, without any qualifying, climb and maintain 12,000. This is kind of the catchy one, because climb and maintain in the US is specifically a new altitude clearance that completely supersedes any of your previous altitude clearances. So you disregard the published altitudes along the way. Here's the catch. Speed restrictions are considered a completely different thing. So climb and maintain changes your altitude clearance. It does not change your lateral clearance, and it does not change your speed restriction, your speed clearance. One thing to note in the US, especially if you are, or North America particularly, but especially if you are not used to flying in North America, you will not see on any of our charts anything that has to do with transition altitude or transition level. Transition altitude is the one that applies to you as you're departing, because that is the altitude at which you transition from a local altimeter setting to the standard altimeter setting. In the U.S. and in North America, it is 18,000 feet all day, every day, even on Christmas. So it's not going to be on any chart because it doesn't have to be. Outside of the U.S., a lot of times it is on the chart. When we get to the east side of the pond, which our friends Ben and Simon will be talking about, they will be talking about the transition level, which is the level at which you're descending through, and you transition back to a local altimeter setting or a local QNH in their case. But we'll get there when we get there. For right now, just know that the TA in North America is 18,000 all the time. Your flight planned altitude that is in your across the pond dashboard refers to your altitude for the oceanic portion. That may or may not be an odd numbered 1,000 going eastbound across the ocean. One interesting thing about the North Atlantic track system is that they are essentially unidirectional, meaning that they're all eastbound at the same time and then they're all westbound at the same time. So we're simulating one portion of the across the pond event. We're simulating one portion of that 24-hour cycle. So you might find even and odd altitudes going through your North Atlantic track. However, prior to reaching the North Atlantic track, you should expect that you're going to be cleared on an eastbound IFR flight level, so an odd numbered 1,000 feet. Oops, I think I skipped one there. Or did I? Nope, this is the last one. Okay, good. Key thing to think about, though, is that anytime you need to change altitudes, and one instance where you might need to change altitudes is you might be on that odd numbered 1,000 going eastbound, but you're going to need to change to what could possibly be an even numbered one for your oceanic entry. So at some point, you're going to need to change from your cruise altitude to the oceanic altitude. Well, before you do that, you have to get ATC clearance. In fact, anytime you want to change altitude, you need to clear that with ATC. You never just do it. Your FMS might have a pre-programmed step climb in it, or it might tell you that your optimal flight level is now higher because you've burnt off more fuel than it expected you would by this point. Again, the difference between your domestic versus your oceanic cruise. Or once you get to your top of descent point, and the FMS has that friendly reminder that says lower MCP altitude. Don't do that until you check with your controller. All right, that is going to do it for my portion for now. I think I'm going to come back and talk to you at the very end about some tips and tricks for the event. But for right now, I turn it over to our next presenter.
And look, I found some friends, Rob.
Yes, I see. They've managed to make it here. I don't know. I know they all got stuck in traffic on the way to their bedrooms, but
yeah, they must have been just waiting for their CTOT to be able to jump on the stream. But hello, Ben, and hello, Simon. And feel free to unmute your mics and welcome aboard. For those who don't know, Rob, as you've just been hearing from, is our long time now, I think the most longest running presenter as part of this series, also the host of Slant Alpha Adventures on Twitch. He is joined now by Ben from VATSIM UK, who's going to talk us through oceanic procedures. And finally, we'll have Simon from BA Virtual talking us through Europe, and they'll do a much better job on either of those subjects than I would. So Ben, I'll hand things over to you if you want to double check your mic there, and we'll jump in and talk about some oceanic procedures whenever you're ready. Give you a second here if you need to work on the microphone.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Evan. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. And yeah, apologies for keeping you all waiting. Hopefully it was worth the wait. We'll see. But yeah, I'm here to talk very briefly about oceanic operations during cross the pond. And as you can see on the screen, we've got 5, agenda items that we want to work through. So by the end of this short presentation, hopefully no more than 10 minutes, you'll have a bit more of an idea about what to be doing over the ocean during cross the pond. So a very brief overview. What is classed as oceanic, or effectively anything that's highlighted here in the diagram. Mainly for across the pond, that'll be New York, Santa Maria Gander, and Shelmwick and Reykjavik. I don't believe, or maybe we do have routes this year going down through PRK. I don't know. But either way, generally speaking, north of the equator, you'll see these guys on for across the pond. So, firstly, latitude and longitude waypoints. These are very common across the ocean. When we're navigating long distances, there's no need to be using named waypoints like we have in sort of a domestic environment, and so we just navigate using coordinates. As you can see on the route here, from the routes, we have 4 coordinates. These are all oceanic, what we'd call waypoints. They can appear in domestic routes, but it's quite uncommon for that to happen. You sometimes see it over Canada, northern Canada, and parts of the US, but generally speaking, it's over the ocean. The big catch here is that the way you enter these waypoints differs very, very differently depending on what aircraft you're flying and what FMS it has fitted. So you can see examples here. Top example for the Boeing FMC, bottom for the Airbus, and even within Boeing alone, there are multiple different formats, as we can see here. There are kind of shorthand formats. There are even longer formats than what's displayed on here. The bottom line really is know how to insert these coordinates into your FMC ahead of time. Use SimBrief if you can, SimBrief uplink, or other form of uplink to get that put into the FMC for you, so you don't have to worry about sort of flying off in the wrong direction, because it does tend to happen once or twice every year. So if you have SimBrief do it for you, that takes care of it all, of course. Well, in theory, it should do. Just a quick, again, caution with the short form. The way you put the November, the whiskey, the echo, the Sierra in that string of numbers changes the waypoint hugely. So you can see here from the graphic on the right, putting a N in the middle of 5060 and N in the end of 5060 results in two hugely different outcomes. So again, if you are having to put in waypoints manually, I would suggest the best course of action is just to use the standard long form and Google how to do that in your particular aircraft. Yes, as mentioned there, where you put the letter changes the outcome massively. And as you can see here, just an example of how those waypoints are displayed. I think this is from an Airbus. Again, your mileage may vary. Please make sure you know how to do this ahead of cross bond. Okay, moving on to oceanic clearance. So I touched on briefly just now when I mentioned the latitude and longitude waypoints, but oceanic clearance is a way for us to separate aircraft across the ocean, because the ocean is is historically a non-radar environment. You know, modern day now we're starting to use sort of space-based surveillance, so ADS-B and ADS-C, those sorts of things. But we still provide a oceanic clearance, at least in Shamrock and Gander. New York and Reykjavik, an oceanic clearance is not explicitly required, but I think there are still requirements to maintain their assigned level and speed. Shamrock and Gander was meant to follow suit, and interestingly has gone back on that within a few weeks of making that decision. So for now, we're still doing oceanic clearances, just as every other across the pond that's gone by, unless you're flying through New York Oceanic, Santa Maria, or Reykjavik. You won't need to call for a clearance, but I think, again, the majority of the routes will pass through Shamrock or Gander at some point. So yeah, as it says here, you need to get this clearance before you enter NAT high-level airspace. So NAT is North Atlantic. NAT is North Atlantic. So NAT track, North Atlantic track. So North Atlantic high-level airspace, you need to have your clearance before you enter. And then, as mentioned, all of the OCAs, your clearance coordinated in the background, so you don't have to call for clearance if you're flying through New York Radio, for example. It will just be sorted for you. There are 3 steps to getting this clearance. First of which is gathering the required information which you need to provide to the controller or to the website, which we'll look at in a second. Then physically making that request and then receiving the clearance, making sure that you have got everything set up in your aircraft to follow that clearance, and then monitoring your aircraft as you cross the ocean to make sure that you are flying what you have been told to fly. So step 1, you will need these 6 things. So your routing is your assigned track, and this will be on your cross the pond slot, your booking page, your briefing page. You'll need an ETA for the oceanic entry points. Your oceanic entry point is the first waypoint on your assigned track. You can find that very easily from looking in your FMC. Make sure you have your simulator set to real world time, because that makes the UTC conversion not a problem. If you have a time offset in your sim compared to the real world time, you're going to have a bit of a headache when it comes to doing this. So I would just recommend use real world time. Makes life easier. Your level, your requested flight level for the oceanic crossing. Again, for CTP, these are assigned, so this will be on your briefing page. Again, another word of caution here, make sure that you are actually able to achieve the assigned flight level for the crossing. If you go and load, full fuel in the 777 and you depart JFK and you've got to hit flight level 370, you're not going to make that probably. So take a sensible amount of fuel for your arrival, but don't overdo it because then you might not be able to reach your required level for the crossing. Your max level, again, this is found in your FMC. Again, just know where to find that in the progress page or the VNAV page within Boeing and progress page in the Airbus. So know where to find that information. Your requested speed, this will depend on your operator and your cost index. But again, if you go on SimBrief on your flight plan, take a look down to a waypoint on the ocean and just see what your planned Mach number is, and that's what you're going to use. So you fly a fixed Mach number across the whole of the ocean. Then finally, the TMI. This is on the track message or the track, I guess, briefing page. So real world, every day the tracks change. The TMI is effectively the number of the day in the year. So we'll be in the 300s now or something. Essentially, that every, if I request NAT Alpha today, the controller knows that I'm requesting today's NAT Alpha. I've not got a copy of yesterday's NAT Alpha, and so it basically makes sure we're on the same track. It's not a huge issue with CTB because we use I say fictional tracks, but the tracks are designed exclusively for CTP, so it's not really an issue. But again, know how to find this. We'll come on to where you can find this in a second. And so, yeah, as mentioned here, getting that information from your FMC, again, knowing your airplane, it's like really basic airmanship. Flying on VATSIM, you should know how to do this stuff anyway, so it shouldn't be a huge task really to get this information. But of course, in the heat of battle, things can you can start to forget things. So write it down if you're a bit forgetful. You're not flying the plane particularly much that you want to fly. Just some bits about confirming the correct time, which we touched on. So this is the NatTrack website. Again, those of you who have flown in previous years will remember this website. I think largely unchanged for this year's CTP, apart from maybe some back-end upgrades. But the way that it works, of course, is that rather than having to call for voice or call on voice for your clearance and spending half an hour shouting over other people and trying to get a word in, you request it via the website, and then we have the controllers assign your clearance through this website. So typically requesting your oceanic clearance between 30 and 45 minutes before you enter that high-level airspace. So Gander or Reykjavik in the case of CTP. Again, if you're entering New York radio, you don't need to request this. And if you're departing close to oceanic airspace, request clearance ASAP. I don't think it's a huge issue because I haven't checked the CTP airport pairs, but I'm pretty sure Gander, Newfoundland isn't one of them. So I think anything like further away than that is probably going to be within half an hour or at least half an hour before you enter NAT airspace. So more of an issue on westbound, departing Dublin, things like that. So this is what the website looks like. A lot of it's pre-populated, things like your call sign, your destination, but you also have to put in a lot of things. So again, as you mentioned earlier, get that information to hand, fill out the form. Requested flight level. Oh, whoops. Your requested flight level, max flight level, requested Mach number, requested track. You should be able to select from the drop down. It should have a list of all the CTP tracks to make life nice and easy. Do not type your route in as a random routing. If you have been assigned the CTP track, you should select that CTP track. Otherwise, it just confuse controllers and just delay getting your clearance effectively. Your entry fix, again, is the first waypoint on that NAT track. Estimated time at entry fix, and the TMI, you can find the TMI at the top of the NAT track website page. So if you don't know where to find that, it's nice and simple, straightforward for you to get it. And then with a bit of luck, this is what you will receive after about 10 to 15 minutes. If you haven't got this within 10 to 15 minutes, call the controller, your domestic controller, and sort of ask them if they can poke the clearance delivery officer, or more likely they might ask you to switch frequencies and speak to them via voice. But either way, this is what you should get. So the kind of top half of the message is what you would probably receive real world if you got this clearance via data link, and it's spelled out quite handily below in sort of plain English for those like me who are a bit slow. So yeah, and that's got all the information which you need to comply with. So your level, your MAC number. In this case, they've stipulated that you have to cross PORTI after 1423. Of course, all times are in Zulu here, so after 1423 Zulu. If you have an RTA function in your aircraft, so basically the multiplier can adjust the aircraft speed to make sure it hits these time constraints, that's really helpful. So I know the FS Labs has it, I know the PMDG 777 has it. Again, check your particular add-on because not all of them seem to have this, even though real world a lot of aircraft do. So yeah, again, if you don't have that function, it's going to be a bit finicky. Basically, slow down, speed up a bit. Look in your FMC when you're estimating to cross this fix. If you're going to get there too early, slow down. If you're going to get there too late, speed up. It's told us here that our speed has changed, so we requested. At the bottom, we can see we requested Mach decimal 82. We've been assigned decimal 81 by ATC. Same with the flight level, we requested 390. We were given flight level 410. So again, just this thing about sort of false expectations and assuming that you'll get cleared to what you requested. That's not always the case, particularly over the Atlantic. It's quite actually common to get differences in flight levels, differences in speeds, sometimes even completely different routes. So not so much on VATSIM, but certainly real world, it's been known to happen. Again, as mentioned earlier, you've got an issue with your clearance. If you can't comply with your clearance, if you haven't received your clearance, if you have any questions regarding anything about my clearance, speak to the current domestic controller. Again, they will more than likely tell you to switch frequencies and go and speak to the clearance delivery officer in person or via voice. But if you just go off AWOL, they're going to start wondering where you've gone and call a supervisor, and 10 minutes passes and no one's sorted out the issue. So always speak to your current controller first before you go away. Use of Salcal. Again, not really much to touch on here other than use the Salcal code that is assigned to you in the CTP briefing page and put that into VPilot before you connect. If you use the Salcal in your aircraft particular livery that you're flying, chances are 10 other people across the pond are also using that same livery, and as such, you're not going to have Salcal working, and none of those people that share that code will. So something to be aware of there. You can turn down the volume of VPilot, but if you turn it off completely, you will miss the Salcal alert. So again, real world, they would turn down the HF radio or turn it off completely. There is a way of doing that, I think, by fudging the VPilot output devices. I always forget how to do it, so I just kind of turn it down a bit, but keep a keen ear out, because if you miss the Salcal alert, the next step's probably going to be a contact me. Failing that, it'll be a supervisor. So you do still have to pay attention, and you can kind of expect when ATC is going to get in touch with you. 30 West, for example, is pretty standard. You're going to get handed off to the next controller. So particularly around those points, make sure you've got it probably turned up a little bit so you can still hear what's going on. So entering oceanic airspace, what do we do? Step one is request a Salcal check, and domestic controllers cannot do this, so you have to wait until you're with Gander, and then secondly with Shamwick. You do it both times on the handover, and this is what it looks like. So Shamwick radio, Virgin 127, Gander next, request Salcal check on Alpha Juliet Echo Sierra. If you forget what your Salcal code is, don't worry, we don't need it on VATSIM to send you a ping, so it's not a huge issue. There is this oceanic convention of stating the recipient's call sign twice. Again, I think mainly because back in the day it was quite common to have people monitoring the different frequencies at once, so it kind of gave them time to switch to the right radio and and dial it in, because again, there's a lot of static, and so again, you can choose not to do that if you don't want to. It's not required. You should hopefully, fingers crossed, receive a ping through vPilot. I think it's like a ding dong, high pitch, low pitch. Yeah, Simon's nodding. That's helpful. Once you hear that chime, you should also get a little like amber message on vPilot saying something SalCal alert or something. Basically respond saying SalCal check OK. You go on with your flight. And as mentioned here, turn down the volume, but don't turn it off completely. Unless you know what you're doing with the output devices, and you can get that all sorted. If there's time at the end, I'm sure Simon can cover how to do that, because I know he knows from last time.
No problem.
And yeah, every time you switch frequencies, conduct a new SalCal check. Squawk 2000, 30 minutes after entering oceanic airspace. It's something everyone should do, but no one ever does, and I don't think it causes a huge issue. So if you forget to do this, like I always do, don't worry too much. Just
always forget myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one every time.
I'm sure it probably does cause carnage in Ireland and Gander, but I don't control there, so not not my problem. But yeah, if it does cause an issue, I do apologize in advance for my advice. So route checking, real world, this is a very lengthy process. Both pilots are involved in doing this, and effectively it's to minimize what we call gross navigational errors. GNEs start here from 2022. More than 3 of these happened every month. And what a GNE is, effectively the plane flies somewhere it shouldn't have been going. So they've input either they've input the wrong coordinates, or the clearance has changed from what they've been given, or from what they had planned, and they've got to put in this new route, or they haven't cross-checked this new route correctly. And again, if you're using SimBrief, there shouldn't be an issue. But the keyword is shouldn't, right? And so it always helps just to give us a quick sense check, checking through each of the waypoints. If the waypoints are in the condensed version, if you click on them once, in Bering World, I think it will display it in full lat long format, and there is a way of going into like the FMC data page and doing it like. That's probably a bit extreme for VATSIM, but basically just making sure that what is in your FMC lines up with what you have in SimBrief and what you have in your CTP planning portal briefing document thing. So that's what you're checking for. You're checking that your entry and exit waypoints match. You're checking that the waypoints in between are all correct, and then you're checking that you have you're either at your assigned level for the oceanic crossing. If you are not at your assigned level for the oceanic crossing, you will need to either request this from the controller or hope they will remember. Oftentimes they don't, because they're not aware of your oceanic cruising level. So, prompt the controller in good time to get that climb. And again, before entering that NAT high level airspace, ensure that you set your fixed speed that's been assigned to you by ATC. And then, yeah, as you're flying across the ocean, you should be sort of checking off waypoints, where you've come from, what you're going to, where you're going next, making sure the plane's turning, all these sorts of things. Again, whether you want to do all that for VATSIM is down to you, I guess, personally, but just be aware that, I guess, for real world, they spend a lot of time doing this for a very good reason, and so there is a chance of you messing this up, and it makes sense to spend 5 or 10 minutes. Even just a quick sense check will pick up most errors.
I mean, you'd have a better time if you ended up where your actual destination airport was, as opposed to somewhere totally in the wrong spot. I mean, if you want to go there, that's fine, but there's no ATC coverage, so yeah.
Right. I love the idea. Love the idea. Well, in the real world, they do it for a very good reason. On VATSIM, we don't care if we hit each other. No, let's try not to hit each other. Okay.
Yeah. There is that, isn't there? Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Ben. As we get set to kind of move on into ICAO and European ops, I do want to just emphasize a couple of things to be talked about. And by the way, if you have any questions about oceanic procedures, something we haven't covered yet, now is a great time to post those wherever you're watching. I will collect them and I'll hand them off to the team, and we'll answer those just as soon as we cover ICAO and Europe. But just one quick note on the CELCALs. Those come in your cross the pond booking. Please make sure you file the CELCAL in your cross the pond booking both in your flight planner marks, and then again, make sure you use that same code when you connect to the network in vPilot or whichever client you're using. If you fail to do those things, you will not get a SELCAL. It will not work. So make sure it's in your flight planner marks, it's in your pilot client when you connect, and it's the same one as in your pilot booking so that all of those things work together. And with that in mind, Ben, you're all set. Anything else you want to talk about with Oceanic, or we'll dive into Europe?
Yeah, I'll wait to the end after Simon's piece, and if Simon has time, we can do how to set up vPilot for the SELCAL alerts. But I think that's a whistle-stop tour from me. Apologies once again. This is dragged on slightly longer than it should have done.
Good stuff.
But
All right,
hopefully
Simon,
we're back on time.
Hand it over to you.
Absolutely. Excellent. So hopefully you can hear me clearly enough.
Yes.
And here we are. So we're going to talk a little bit about ICAO and European operations. So over the next 15 minutes or thereabouts, we'll have a little chat about CPDLC. Spoiler alert, it's not going to take very long to talk about that, and you'll find out why. We'll talk about how arrivals work across Europe and the rest of the world, particularly if you are coming at this from a North American sort of background, and also about things like descent and approach procedures and phraseology that you might hear that might be a little bit different to what you are used to. So a couple of key things then. If you only remember 3 things from the next 15 minutes, then here they are. And the first one is double check the things that you have loaded. There are differences depending on the runway which is in use. So therefore, make sure you've got the right one loaded. Never start the descent without authorization. Ask ATC first. You would never start down without some sort of explicit clearance. And the transition level and altitude can vary wildly, and does vary wildly. It can be as low as 3,000 feet or as high as about 15,000 feet across Europe, just from memory, and even as high as 18,000 in some parts of the world outside the US as well. So the important takeaway here is to make sure you have a read through the charts and indeed the ATIS, which will pretty much always give you the transition level so that you know where to switch your altimeter setting. So en route CPDLC, I told you it's going to be quick and to the point, which is that in real life and indeed on VATSIM in many cases, data link clearance and CPDLC, this is text-based communications for pilots, is available at many facilities across Europe, South America and Africa, but it probably will not be used across the pond this year, primarily because the system isn't really robust enough to handle the amount of traffic that it gets, and it all falls over and it all gets very confusing. Things take a long time to get through. There's just no point. So don't worry about it. It won't be in use. So as I mentioned earlier, and as Rob mentioned in his part of the presentation, on the North American side, this is dead easy as far as transition altitude and level is concerned, because it's just fixed at 18,000 feet. Unlike in the US, in Europe and indeed across the rest of the world, the transition altitude and transition level vary from airport to airport, not even from country to country. It can be different from one airport to the next. And as I mentioned, could be very low, could be quite high. The takeaway is it will always be on the charts. Just as a quick throwaway, just in case you weren't aware what the difference is between transition altitude and transition level, why it's significant. Obviously at lower levels, when we're flying approaches or departures, it's quite important that we know how high we are above terrain, and therefore we need to make sure that our altimeter is set to the correct altimeter, the correct QNH, the setting that's going to give us our height above mean sea level. When we're a bit higher up in the cruise, generally speaking, we're more bothered about not hitting other aeroplanes, and so we set our standard pressure setting 1013, 29.92 inches of mercury, which is going to make sure that although our height indicated on the altimeter is not necessarily going to be the precise height above the above mean sea level at that particular moment, at least we're all going to be out by the same amount. So we're all sort of going to be 1,000 feet apart in the cruise together. So really easy way. So whenever we're above the transition altitude, so when we've climbed above the transition altitude, we're going to set standard pressure, and we need to have our local pressure QNH set when we descend below the transition level. Really easy way to remember the difference between the two, which I learned fairly recently. If you're ever confused about the difference between transition altitude and transition level, well, transition altitude has an A in it, which looks a bit like that. And you'll see that A shape has a little up arrow. So the transition altitude is relevant to you when you are climbing up away from the airfield. Transition level, on the other hand, has a V, or looks a little bit like a down arrow, right? So when we're descending, we need to worry about the transition level, which will always be expressed in terms of a flight level. So when we descend below the transition level, we need to set our local pressure setting, otherwise known as QNH. So in most ICAO countries, and indeed certainly across the UK and Europe, air traffic will assign the star, the arrival procedure, and you generally won't file it in the flight plan. I think Germany actually is one exception to this, but even then, you can expect to be cleared for a specific star by air traffic. And the most important thing is that you load the correct procedure. So there can be some subtle differences. So you might have several arrivals starting at the same point. In this case, you might be able to see on the screen PSAP. In this case, you can see in the background is the PSAP 1 X-ray arrival, for example. And in the foreground, we've got the PSAP 1 Golf. So they both start at the same point, but they obviously take very different routes. And in some cases, so in this case, they go to different runways, in fact. So in many cases, the airport will have different stars for each runway, and indeed potentially several different stars for each runway. Which may be used depending on traffic conditions, which may be used depending on various different factors that air traffic will be concerned about. So couple of things to note. Obviously, as I say, make sure that you load the one that you are cleared for, and if you see PSAP 1 Foxtrot, and you look on the chart and you see, oh, well, it's cleared for PSAP 1 Golf. I can't see that, but I can see PSAP 1 Foxtrot. I'm sure it'll be the same. Probably won't be. So that's the first thing to take away from that. And the second thing is to have a look through the charts in advance. Spend some of that time whilst you're in the cruise with your feet up, reading the newspaper, doing the crossword. Rob's listening to Taylor Swift. Make sure, just take a moment, have a glance through the charts, because often they'll give you a clue as to which arrival you can most likely expect. It may be buried somewhere in the textual data. It may be on the chart itself. Some arrivals will be labeled by ATC, in which case, as you might expect, they'll only be assigned by ATC. You wouldn't ever plan on getting them as a routine thing. Others will not have any notes against them, which often means that they are kind of a bit more routine, or they might say night only this time, whatever. So you can generally anticipate a little bit what you're likely to get, but the key thing is listen to what you are assigned. And all of that comes into briefing the arrival and the approach. As a very good friend of mine who was a very senior training captain for a very big airline once said to me, you should be the world expert in the approach or departure procedure that you're about to fly. So in other words, nobody else should know more about what is going on, about all these different things that I've put up on the screen there that you might want to think about. Nobody else should know in the world should know more about that than you at that particular moment for that particular situation. And this is something which I can talk about for hours and hours and hours, and we could do a whole seminar on this, but we've only got a couple of minutes. So suffice to say, have a bit of a think, try and have a bit of a structure for how you think about briefing the arrival and the approach. One of the things that we talk about in terms of situation awareness and building situation awareness, and effective briefings are part of this. We talk about notice, having different levels of situation awareness. So we talk about notice, understand, think ahead, nutter. So the idea being that you have to build these levels of SA one upon the top of the other. So in other words, you first have to sort of gather the information. So you have to notice, for example, that there's a great big crosswind, or a great big crosswind, right? Your arrival airfield. Okay, so that's it. You've noticed that information. Next level up might be understanding that. Okay, so is it within the crosswind limits of the aeroplane? Yes, it is. Think ahead. Okay, well, is there some maybe some rain in the forecast? What about the wet crosswind limit? How would we deal with that? If that came about, how much fuel have we got if we needed to hold, wait for it to die down, potentially where could we divert to, and so on and so forth. And you see how none of that could come unless we first gathered the information in the first place, and we have to build it up from there. So try and think about that. Do some good nuttering. Try and always be operating at think ahead level. And the other thing I'd say in terms of planning and briefing your arrival, your approach, and your departure procedures as well, is try and think about not just what you're going to do, but how you're going to do it. So what sort of modes you're going to use, how exactly are you going to achieve it, when are you expecting to have the airplane configured, slowed down by, set yourself some gates, as you go down the arrival. What height, speed do I want to be at various points? What am I going to do if I don't achieve those gates? And set yourself some hard bottom lines as well. What below, if we get beyond this point, then what action are we going to take to mitigate whatever it might be, whether it's a rushed approach, whether it's anything like that. Are we going to go around? Are we going to, if we get below this fuel figure, we'll ask for a divert, and so on and so forth. So thinking about those gates, think about those bottom lines, think about how you're going to achieve the arrival or the approach are always really good things to think about when you're briefing, building up that situation awareness, as opposed to just what you're going to do, reading off the chart, tracks and distances and waypoints, and saying, well, I'm going to fly from here to here to here to here to here. Great. Okay. You can read the chart. I can read the chart, but how are you going to do it? The other thing, actually, I should say, just before we move on from there, is as Rob has already mentioned, as Evan has already mentioned as well, you will have a cross the pond pilot briefing provided to you in the briefing section of the website, and that is definitely really good information that you can use to bring into that approach briefing or departure briefing, and information about how the airfield is likely to operate during cross the pond, and in those particular situations, things that you can expect. Bring them in, look at them, read through them, think about how you're going to deal with any of those potential scenarios that might crop up. Quick word about holding. You can expect holding, particularly on this side of the Atlantic, this side being the the eastern side. Very, very commonly used, certainly in the UK and in parts of other parts of Europe as well, and the rest of the world. So a couple of different types of holds, published and unpublished. Published ones are shown on the approach chart. So they're holds that exist, you know all the information about them from the chart, right? So you shouldn't need any further information from air traffic in order to fly that hold. And here's an example of one at Bovingdon that you can see on the screen here. ATC can potentially issue unpublished holds by giving you a fix and an inbound leg and a leg distance and a turn direction and so on. Doesn't tend to happen really very much, certainly in my experience. Pretty much everything is done within a published hold. In any event, when you are programming that hold into your flight management system, some information that you'll need to know, obviously the fix that you are holding over, in this case, Bovingdon, Bravo, November, November, the inbound course of the hold, that is 116 degrees, you can see on the screen there. Obviously the direction of turns, so standard turns in a hold are right hand. So if nobody says anything, if you were given an unpublished hold, if you're just told to hold over Bovingdon on the 116 radial inbound and no other information was given, you could assume it was going to be right-hand turns. And the length of the hold, you'll see in the middle there, it's stated as 1 minute in this case, which is the standard inbound leg distance timing, I should say, below flight level 140. The ICAO standard above flight level 140 is for 1.5 minutes. Strictly speaking, that is timing on the inbound leg. So the idea, if you were flying this all raw data and all that kind of stuff, the sort of stuff that Rob likes doing, the idea is you would adjust the timing of the outbound leg based on the winds in order to make your inbound leg 1 minute. But in practice, if you're using an FMS, it's going to sort it all out for you. The other thing that's worth mentioning actually as well that I don't think is on the slide, but is the speed that you're going to fly in the hold. Generally speaking, from your point of view as a pilot, well, you probably want to fly the most economical speed, which is generally going to be somewhere around about your minimum clean speed. But there are also potentially maximum speeds in the hold. Certainly in London, the maximum holding speed up to flight level 140 from and I think you're about 240 knots above that. ICAO standing holding speeds are a little bit higher than that, but not a lot. So, if you fly any faster than that in the hold, then certainly you're going to start going outside of the airspace that's been set aside for that hold. So very important that you think about the airspeed that you're flying, and generally think about making sure that you're going to fly it at a speed that is going to be economical for you as best as possible, as long as it's less than the maximum holding speed. And this is a good example of where we talked about nutter earlier on: notice, understand, think ahead. So again, we're listening on the radio, we can hear that it's busy and that other aircraft ahead of us are being issued holds that are on the same route as us. Well, the understanding point of that might be, okay, well, everybody else is getting a hold that's on the same route as us. It's likely that we might get a hold as well. Think ahead. Well, let's program the hold in the box so it's ready. We're not going to execute it until we actually get told to hold, but we're going to have it in there ready to go. Think about how much fuel we've got. Think about where is our alternate. Do we need to set up a secondary route in our secondary flight plan if we've got that facility to our alternate? What's the maximum amount of time we could hold for? In this case, you'll see actually often the box will tell you that. In this case, 40 minutes, for example, if we hold at our most efficient speed. And at what point, what would our bottom line in terms of fuel be, in terms of, when could we leave? What's the latest point at which we could leave the hold if we needed to divert to our alternate, and so on. I'm also thinking, especially if it's busy and lots of aircraft to divert, you might want to think about where are we actually going to be able to divert to, and keeping aware of that, and where's busy and where's accepting diversions. All that sort of stuff is definitely something you'd want to have in your mind as you're going round and round in circles. So in summary, make sure you are ready for holding. You can certainly expect it during Across the Pond. So spend a bit of time between now and the event, if you haven't already, familiarizing yourself with how you do this in your aeroplane. Something else you will get in the hold is air traffic will give you a time that you can expect to leave the hold. It's known as an expected further clearance, or EFC time. And the phraseology that is typically used for that is shown on the screen there. The key thing here is this is not a clearance to do so. It is just a piece of information for your forward planning. And in real life, what it does primarily is, in many cases, it might allow you to quote unquote commit, not commit, we don't like using that term anymore, dispense with the alternate. So in other words, say be a bit more flexible around your fuel usage. So for example, you might be able to say, okay, we know how long we're going to be sat in the hold, and therefore we're happy that we can burn perhaps into some of that fuel we might have used to go to an alternate, because we can be reasonably confident we're going to go and fly an approach at our planned destination. Key thing, not a clearance to leave the hold. So let's have a spin through some thoughts around arrivals, stars, and approaches, and some of the phraseology that you will hear. So here's a couple of arrivals: the running 1 X-ray and the never 4 whiskey transition. So we think about stars, arrivals, and transitions. If you think of sort of your arrival, your star as kind of like the trunk route, if you like, and then that finishes at a point, and then you might have various transitions going from that particular point off to different places, your sort of local off ramps kind of thing. So you might. And certainly in parts of Europe, particularly Germany, there are particular transitions that are used for different runways. Generally tends to be the way that these are used. So if you are cleared for the running 1 X-ray arrival or the never 4 whiskey transition, what that clears you to do is to follow the lateral and speed constraints on that particular star or the transition. But as we mentioned right at the top of the shop, what you're not going to do is descend until you have an explicit clearance to do so. Here's another variation on a theme. For example, cleared for the running 1 X-ray arrival with the runway 04 transition. So that is 2 in 1. You are going to follow the lateral and speed constraints on the star and on that specified transition. You can load them both up in your FMS and have them set up and ready to go. Again, what you're not going to do is leave your current cleared level unless you have a specific clearance to do so. Something I will point out here, which is worth bearing in mind when you're briefing your arrival, is in many cases where sort of transitions are in use for different runways that lead you onto the final approach, it is very likely that those transitions that you see on the chart are going to be quite a lot longer than what you're actually going to fly in practice, and that can lull you into a false sense of security in terms of your descent planning. So it is worth having a look at that, because you might see that, you look at the FMS and see you've got 150 track miles to run, when in fact you're probably going to get a shortcut that might cut out 50 of those miles. So and then suddenly you're going to find yourself very high on profile if you haven't thought about how that descent's going to work. So one thing that is often quite useful doing is perhaps hardening some of the altitudes in the FMS. So if they're all sort of at or above, picking one that's sort of on a kind of downwind or sort of a beam in the airfield or something like that, and setting it as a hard instead of 7,000 above, saying is, let's say, a hard flight level 70 or something like that, just to give you a slightly more realistic descent profile as far as your planning is concerned. And then obviously air traffic will give you the specifics in terms of your actual descent clearance. Cleared never for whiskey transition and profile. What does this mean? Well, it means that you're going to follow the lateral, the altitude, and the speed constraints on the transition and descend no further than the last level on the transition. So here we are. We are somewhere over this side of never at somewhere above 5,000 feet. And what we're going to do is we are going to make sure that we descend to cross never at 5,000 feet. We're going to make sure we're back at 180 knots by point mind, and then we're going to be 3,500 or above at found, and we're going to descend to be level at more by at a level at more at 3,500 feet, and that is where we are going to stop our descent. We're going to go no further than the last level on that transition. Another instruction that you hear quite a lot in ICAO land, including Europe, including the UK, is when ready, brackets instruction. So it might be when ready, descend flight level 130 to be level by Totley or something like that. So this essentially is equivalent in the US to pilot's discretion. So you're going to comply with all the charted restrictions but you're going to descend at your discretion when you're ready to do so, basically. For example, when you reach your FMS computed top of descent, assuming that is the case. So assuming that you've got your restrictions all programmed in correctly into the box. But yeah, it seems to cause a little bit of confusion, but essentially it is a pilot's discretion instruction. It's not an instruction to do right now. It's not a passive aggressive, are you ready then? It is literally just when you're ready, you start down, as long as you comply with the constraints that might have been put in. Something else you might get in Europe and ICAO land, not in the UK, is descend via star to wherever, in this case, flight level 70. So what are we going to do if we get that? Well, it's very much the same as in North America. We're going to start our descent immediately. We're going to meet all the published altitude and speed restrictions. But what we're not going to do is descend any lower than, in this case, flight level 70. So we would make sure we made that above 100 and below flight level 130 at Totley. We'd make sure we were at 250 knots by Totley, and we would make sure we were level at arrival at flight level 70, but we're not going to go any lower than that. Variation on a theme, descend via star to flight level 70, just cancel level restriction at Totley. So what are we going to do? We are going to start down immediately. We're just not going to do this bit, the flight level 130 and so on. We can just ignore that if we wish to, and we're just going to go straight to 70 by arrival, but we are going to comply obviously with our speed constraint here of 250 knots at Totley. You will never hear that instruction, incidentally, in the UK, and we'll get onto that in a bit. The kind of least restrictive, as it says on the tin, variation that you will get is descend unrestricted to flight level 70, and that does pretty much what it says on the tin. You're going to descend to flight level 70. Nothing on the chart applies anymore. Descend flight level 90 to be level by fake. What we're going to do is descend immediately to flight level 90. We're going to cross fake at flight level 90, and if there was something charted previously, for example, our flight level 130 below, 100 above, and 250 knots at Totley, we would comply with those. If we are outside of the UK, for example, you shouldn't really get this, and to be honest, you're probably not going to get this clearance outside of the UK very much. It would be poor phraseology. It would be, generally you'd get some variation more like this. In the UK, some would say we are different to our North American, certainly our US friends. We are the same, and some might say it is simpler in a sense. Everything ATC says overrides anything that was charted or anything that you were cleared to do previously by the controller or another controller. So if you are in the UK and you are instructed to descend flight level 70, you are going to descend immediately to 70, and you are going to ignore everything that is on the chart and indeed anything else that a controller had said. The only thing you are going to do is you are still going to comply with any speed restrictions that are charted. Descend flight level 70 level by arrival. Again, you're going to descend flight level 70. You're going to make sure you reach flight level 70 by arrival. Again, it overrides the levels that are on the chart, or indeed anything that ATC had previously given you. So if you'd previously been instructed to cross Totley at flight level 130, and then you are subsequently cleared to descend flight level 70 by arrival, unless that flight level 130 at Totley is restated, you can ignore it. Then it supersedes it. So very much again the same as in the US, other than again we're going to continue to comply with any charted speeds. Couple of words then about approach and landing. So when you get to the end of the star, if you see on track or then on heading, you're going to follow that instruction until you receive further information. You might see a chevron line like this, which means basically continue on that track, speed and altitude, expect radar vectors from there. If you see a clearance limit, something like this at the bottom here, where it says do not proceed beyond the Occam VOR without ATC clearance, if you get there and you haven't had some sort of instruction to leave Occam on a heading or something like that, then the expectation is that you will just enter the hold and await further instructions. What is most important is that you don't descend or turn towards the runway without some further authorization from ATC. Don't just delete the transition and end up doing something like that, or just delete the discontinuity, just head yourself straight towards the runway. That's not going to make you very popular. Vacating the runway,
popular, but for the wrong reason.
Yes, indeed. Yes, you may indeed become quite well known, but not for reasons that anybody wants to be. So when you vacate the runway, the key thing is it's going to be very busy. There is going to be another aeroplane up your chuff, and if you don't get off the runway in a prompt fashion, then you are again not going to be very popular because the other guy behind you who's just been flying for 8.5 hours is going to be going around, and he's going to be flying for another 10 or 15 or 20 minutes or whatever before he can get resequenced. So make sure that you are clear of the runway, fully clear of the runway, all the way past the hold bar before you stop. There might be some instructions about this as far as the specific airport that you are flying into is concerned. So again, I would encourage you to have a read through the charts, the textual data, the AOI pages, as they call them. Whilst you're sat there in the cruise, have a look to see if there is any instructions in there, and indeed the cross the pond pilot brief. Once you are fully clear of the runway, then you can expect or indeed request taxi instructions from ATC. And again, as I mentioned, there might be some preferential or mandatory exit points which will be included in the briefing. So get off the road is the short headline as far as that is concerned. And finally, last but by no means least, taxiing in. Again, something to think about when you are planning that arrival briefing, making sure that you are the world expert in the airport that you are flying into. There might be some standardized taxi routes. If that is the case, they will be included in your airfield briefing from the Cross the Pond website, and they will most likely be on the charts as well. For example, here we can see at Amsterdam, some taxiways are used anti-clockwise. For example, taxiway Bravo, indicated by the arrow pointing or the triangle pointing in the anti-clockwise direction there, and others like Alpha and Charlie are used in the clockwise sense, as you can tell, because the triangle points in that direction. So it is very well worth having a look at the chart, picking out things like that, looking for things like that, as I mentioned, as part of that arrival briefing. Have a sense of where you're likely to go, which side of the runway you want to vacate, roughly where you expect to taxi, and when you do get those taxi instructions, make sure you've got the chart to hand ready in advance. Follow it along, note them down, follow the instructions carefully, take your time, don't rush, and if for whatever reason you can't accept the place that ATC want you to park, just let them know. The key to everything is, as always, talk to ATC and keep them informed if there's something that they want you to do that you can't. And as I say, bear in mind if you might be held at some point in between. But otherwise, again, prior preparation and planning prevents poor performance. All the P's will keep you happy and safe. And there we go.
Very good. Thank you, Simon. I think I am going to kind of run you back through much of what we covered today so far has been really applicable to any time that you're flying on VATSIM. But we're going to kind of circle back and talk about some tips and tricks that are specific to the Cross the Pond event. First and foremost, the pilot briefings are posted on the dashboard over at ctp.vatsim.net. You want to go to that website and to the subpage called Dashboard, and that'll show you your slot, your assigned slot, and then that will include links to the pilot briefing for your departure airport and for your arrival airport. There's also a briefing for the oceanic portion. So if you missed anything that Ben covered about flying over the ocean, a lot of it is covered in that oceanic pilot briefing that is available on the website. In your pilot briefing for your arrival and departure airport, they might have some scenery recommendations. They often will include both freeware and payware scenery recommendations. So please check that out. But you often do want to try and find some scenery add-ons to enhance the scenery at the origin and destination again, if nothing else, because like I said before, the default taxiway signage might not be correct, but oftentimes if it's a freeware or payware add-on, those have been corrected. So that will help make your job easier as you're trying to find your way around those airports. Speaking of charts, you want to make sure you have them. Make sure you know how to access them. Navigraph is a great service that allows you to have charts for the entire world. But if you don't have that, you can try some freeware sources such as ChartFox, or you can, if you have the US ones are of course publicly available on SkyVector or other FAA based websites, but certainly you want to know in advance where you're going to find the charts you need for your origin airport, your departure procedure, your routing, your arrival procedure, your approaches, and your destination aerodrome. Bring extra fuel. How much extra fuel? That's always the perennial question. How much extra fuel should I bring? Well, of course, you have your normal alternates, reserves, and contingencies, but I would also consider adding maybe 60 to 90 minutes as just a general guideline, as this event tends to be very, very high traffic and delays are not uncommon. Do I want to put in more than 90 minutes? Well, that's personal. You can make that decision on your own. If you entered a hold and the controller told you expect further clearance in 90 minutes, would you really stay connected? Well, if the answer is yes, then maybe consider having a little bit more extra fuel. But I guess 60 to 90 minutes is a decent guideline, and you can kind of judge from there whether you want to go further than that. One good tip is to, at the very beginning, when you file your flight plan, just copy and paste it straight in from your booking that's on that ctp.vatsim.net website, because one thing that the controllers are all going to be doing is using some automated tools to sort out these very, very high levels of traffic. And one thing that will help them automatically filter out event traffic versus non-event traffic will be whether you're filed the correct route. So if you file it exactly as it's in the booking, that's going to help them kind of discern who's officially in the event and who's trying to nudge their way in. The discussion about SellCal, Ben covered this, but I'll say it again. Make sure you use the SellCal code that is on your dashboard, ctp.vatsim.net. It's got to be the code that you use when you connect vPilot, XPilot, or Swift. It's got to be in your flight plan remarks. It should not be the one that is pasted on the little placard in your plane, because everyone who has that same plane has that same SellCal. Don't use that one. Use the one that is in your ctp.vatsim.net booking on your dashboard page there. Connect so that you're ready to push at the time specified in your booking. One thing that is new this year is they have included in your dashboard not only the CTOT, calculated takeoff time, but they also have your push time at many of the airports. Not all of the departure airports do you see this, but most of the departure airports in this year's event, they now have an automatically calculated push time in addition to your slot time, which is the actual anticipated takeoff time. So push at the time specified in the booking. Be ready to push at the time specified in the booking. Request to push at the time specified in the booking. But your departure airport's pilot briefing may give you some additional and more detailed guidelines as to how far in advance you should be making that request and how far in advance of that you should be connecting to the network. So please make sure that you check that out in those pilot briefing documents. Cross the Pond is a very, very busy event. So try not to be the guy who is jumping the line by trying to text your controller or trying to private message your controller. Everyone's going to be trying to reach them by voice. And if you're like, oh, I've tried 6 times and he hasn't heard me, well, I'll just put it in the text chat. Certainly he's going to see me there. Everyone's in the same boat. So if everyone did that, then the text just becomes mass chaos. So it doesn't really help you. If you are someone who uses text because of a limitation, you're not able to use voice, that is fine. But if you're jumping on text as a means to try to subvert the fact that voice is chaos and they haven't answered you, trust me, they will answer you when they can. The controllers in those cases, they know which one is the most important plane that they need to talk to next. And if you're not that plane, you just need to be patient. Finally, pay attention. Distractions need to be kept to a minimum during critical phase. I always say sterile cockpit below 10,000 feet, typically during your terminal airspace phases, the departure, the arrival, the approach. Those are times when you want to not be rocking out to your Taylor Swift. You want to not be watching, the latest season of Below Deck just dropped, so I'm going to be checking that out on Netflix or whatever. Shut that all off and be paying attention to the radio, especially during those most critical times, and be listening out for your call sign, especially if it's a call sign that you don't often or ordinarily use. So just be ready for that. Try not to be that guy with special requests and lengthy transmissions. This is a day to keep it simple, keep it concise, keep it precise. Don't be trying to do everything differently than anybody else. Again, everyone gets on me for this, but I'll say it anyway again. You know that on any other day, I love trying to fly non-RNAV stuff in a busy event. You're gonna have to read the room sometimes with that stuff, though. Sometimes it does add to the controller workload. It might add to it incrementally. And if you're the only guy doing it, it's added this much workload. But if everyone did it, it's adding this much workload. So just be mindful of that and really just kind of fall in line and do what everyone else is doing. This is a day where workload management is at the premium for a controller. So anything that you're doing to add to a controller's workload is really just having a negative effect. And if everyone did it, right, it only works because most people follow the guidelines. So try to be most people today. Follow the guidelines. Just do what everyone else is doing. All that other stuff is great to do in other events. This is not the event for that kind of stuff. Again, I know I'm going to catch some hate for that, but outside of CTP, I love non-RNF stuff. Anyway, additional resources that you can check out if you want some more information. The pilot briefings, we already discussed that. The CTP Discord is a great place to ask questions. We've got a Ask the Planning Team is probably not the best channel right now, but there's an Ask the Community channel that you can use in there, and other folks who have some experience with this event can answer. There's a knowledge base on Gander's site, and then the Oceanic Briefing package, again, as I mentioned, in addition to your origin and your destination briefings, there is an Oceanic Briefing on that CTP dashboard, so please feel free to check that out. And Evan, I will turn this program back over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Simon. And thank you to the great audience for some fantastic questions and comments all across a variety of different platforms. I've got all of those questions lined up, and we will power through them here basically in the order of the presentation. So we'll start with some general questions, move on to departures out of the North America and the Americas, moving to Oceanic, and then finally talk about the arrival into Europe and ICAO. And I'm still here looking, so if you have any other questions, fire them. Now is your chance to do that. I want to just start just to remind everybody, if you do not have a slot time, if you do not have a slot booking for this event, the ask is that you do not fly across the Atlantic Ocean or fly into any of the airports that are event airports in Europe. There are lots of other great places to fly on VATSIM, so pick one of those. Now, that being said, friendly reminder, tomorrow, 17 Zulu on October the 17th, or sometime around that time, there will be probably a few slots that get dropped because they're unconfirmed. So if you're still looking to grab a slot, pay attention to the Cross the Pond Discord tomorrow on October the 17th. Good chance, or at least a chance, you might find one. So let me start with a couple of general questions. Rob, I'll fire these ones off at you, looking at mostly the departure procedure stuff. Manafi Games on YouTube wanted to know, is there a problem with only having access to an older version of the AIRAC and maybe not the most up-to-date one?
Well, yes and no, and it depends. So there's your precise answer there. It has become recently part of the code of conduct that you have to be able to follow the updated procedure. Now, does that mean you have to actually have only the present version of the AIRAC cycle? It's definitely preferred, but if it's not the most recent revision, it's possible that not much has changed in the particular procedures that you're flying. So you're going to have to look at those. Look at the one that's in your FMC versus the one that's on the chart and make a judgment call. Is this basically the same thing? Sometimes there's a procedure update and it went to the Blubby 4 departure became the Blubby 5 departure because they changed the wording of one of the notes. And so if it's something simple like that, yeah, you can fly it. It's the same procedure in terms of the the lateral procedure, the altitude restrictions and the speed restrictions, all the same. That's fine, but you're going to have to look at it, make that judgment call. Is it substantially the same procedure? Yes, I can fly it. Or has it changed so substantially that it's a completely different routing? Then no, you shouldn't. So that you just have to look at it and make that judgment call.
Yeah, absolutely. And continuing on, Rob, with you, if air traffic control in the United States or in the Americas is giving you an unrestricted climb, is that canceling the 250 knot restriction below 10,000 feet?
Typically not. Typically that 250 under 10 is universal-ish. If you need to ask to clarify, you're more than welcome to do that. But unrestricted climb typically is canceling the altitude restrictions and not canceling the speed restrictions. You don't actually often hear the term unrestricted climb in the U.S. You'll just hear climb and maintain. But yeah, if you can always ask for clarification.
Yeah, and of course the 250 below 10 is just generally going to apply unless your minimum clean speed is 260, in which case
Right.
We don't expect you to stall the plane, and we don't expect you to fly around with flaps out till you can climb.
Right.
It's naturally acceptable to go faster than that if that's the slowest you can go. And then Simon, to flip that question for the arrival portion, so again, you're given an unrestricted descent clearance or descent unrestricted 2, does the 250 below 10 still apply if it's applicable in a particular country that you're in?
No, sorry, yes is the short answer. So exactly the same as in the US, basically. So although the slight difference outside the US is in the US, that 250 below 10 is very much a sort of set down in law thing, whereas in most cases outside, certainly in the UK and Europe, it's more an airspace class thing. So if you're in a class of airspace, i.e. class A or Alpha Bravo and Charlie, I want to say. We don't do Bravo and Charlie in the UK, really. So class Alpha, you can ATC have it in their gift to lift that speed restriction, and generally they will do so by saying no no ATC speed restriction or high speed approved or something like that, and you can ask the question.
Perfect. Question from Mark. This will go back to you, Rob. How do handoffs to departure happen, specifically in the United States? Do we expect the controllers are going to switch us, or do we just switch more airborne?
Okay. So handoff. So once you've gotten your takeoff clearance,
yeah,
the tower, from the tower, the handoff to departure. In the U.S., it is almost 100% the case that the tower controller will specifically issue that handoff to you verbally at the time they want you to switch. In Canada, there are cases where they will give you that departure switch with your takeoff clearance as part of your takeoff clearance. But in both of those cases, you are still getting that verbal instruction. There are no that I'm aware of cases in the US or Canada where you would just switch as a matter of routine.
Yeah, so some places in Canada, they'll have a little note on the chart that'll say contact departure control airborne unless otherwise instructed. So you'll be given that in some form or another. And another good reminder also that in the US, we like to sometimes be a little bit secretive about our departure frequencies. So the tower may just say contact departure. They may not give you a frequency. That has been previously issued to you in your clearance, and it's probably on the chart. So that's the thing that as we talk about in our takeoff briefing and procedures, we're at the runway, the tower frequency is on COM1. My next frequency should be the departure frequency, which I already know because it was given to me in my clearance or it's on the SID. And if you're told contact departure, you're just clicking one button as opposed to trying to panic scroll in a frequency there as you're just trying to get off the ground. So
and if you forgot it, it's in that PDC, which, as I told you, you don't close that tab until you're airborne. So you can refer back to that.
Moving on to oceanic stuff for Ben, and questions from both Armchair Flight Sim and Jay on YouTube. Should we be programming offsets? So this is the SLOP, strategic lateral offset procedure. Is that something that we should be doing, and do we need an ATC clearance to do so?
Absolutely, yeah. So SLOP is approved. I think up to 2 nautical miles right of track. You only offset to the right, never to the left. I think the reason for that is so that if you have an engine fail or something, you can offset to the left and then you're not coming down into sort of traffic below you and stuff. So always to the right, maximum of 2 miles in 0.1 nautical mile increments. Not all aircraft can do that. So generally speaking, you fly dead on the middle, like center track. You fly 1 mile to the right, or you fly 2 miles to the right. Google random number generator 0 to 2, and then that will give you a good starting point. Again, you might want to adjust that if you notice you're following another plane in front of you. You might want to offset a little bit to be out of their wake, or for a little bit for weather, if that might help. But never more than 2 miles. So provided that you're early offsetting up to 2 miles, you don't have to tell ATC at all. You just have to remember that you remove that offset before you exit oceanic airspace. So by the time you reach Dublin or France or whoever, you should be flying the center line of that track again.
Well, just to clarify, it is acceptable to just fly the path and not offset. Yep. It's something you can do. It's not something you must do.
Yeah, obviously, if everyone offset, then it would defeat the point of offsetting, right? So you want to have an even distribution of planes. This is the idea, So back in the day of before GPS, you got that naturally as sort of IRSs tended to drift over time. Planes would wander by to 20 miles sometimes. Obviously now with everyone on GPS, everyone is right on top of each other. So that's the whole point of SLOP. Again. Cool to do if you can. So yeah, go for it.
I want to talk about altitudes. A couple questions on this, both from Voxel Aviation and Greg Duke about altitudes. So let's just cover everything. Off the ground, file the altitude that you want to climb to, which would be an eastbound altitude since that's the way we're going. So if you want to start at 33,000, 35,000, it doesn't matter what's in your oceanic booking. It doesn't matter what's in your slot. If you want to go to 33,000, that's the altitude that you file initially on the ground. Then you will be given an altitude that goes into your transatlantic portion. That is the altitude that you enter into NatTrack if you're getting an oceanic clearance, or the altitude you can expect to get when you get across the ocean in some of the other oceanic sectors. Might be a good idea if that altitude is an eastbound altitude to file it initially if you can, but you don't have to. Once you get to NatTrack, you're putting in the flight level that is in your booking and the maximum altitude that you're capable of. They may give you something higher, but they will most likely give you your assigned altitude. And then if you do want a higher altitude over the ocean, Ben, you can maybe check me on this one. You can always ask for it, but you may not get it because it's across the pond. Fair enough?
Yeah, that's pretty much spot on. Again, like I say, it depends on traffic and a particular sector, so it's not guaranteed. I think real world is quite rare that you'd plan a step climb during oceanic airspace because, again, the probability is you won't get it, and you don't want to plan to be at a higher level, therefore burning less fuel and not get that. So I think in SimBrief there's an option you can toggle off step climbs over the ocean, and I would recommend doing that in your flight planning just so that it sets you at that one level, that one speed for the whole oceanic crossing. You don't have to worry about it then. If you can climb, then great. You save a bit of fuel, but you're not burning into any sort of contingencies or reserves by staying below where you want to be, if that makes sense.
Perfect. And Ben, the question from Jay, and this one may be a bit specific to the oceanic sector, but their question was on the first contact with Gander or some other oceanic sector, should I be reporting my full position, speed, altitude, and everything, or do I really just need to focus on the SELCAL check?
So I can speak for Gander and Shamwick and say absolutely you do not need to report that. I'd be very surprised if New York and Reykjavik do, because so New York and Reykjavik use ADS-C, so it's kind of radar. Everyone's going to kind of complain now and say that I'm wrong, and I am wrong, just to be clear. It's not radar, but it's similar enough. You can kind of see what the planes are. And so they simulate that on VATSIM. They don't require any sort of SELCAL, I don't know. I don't know if they use SELCAL. I don't know. But certainly Gander and Shamwick, we still use SELCAL. So on first contact with Gander radio and first contact with Shamwick radio, you should request this. You do not need to provide or request a position report. You don't have to report your assigned Mach or your assigned speed or anything like that. I would caveat that with, if you're unsure, just provide it and be on the safe side. So if you're flying through New York and Reykjavik and the useless person from the online stream couldn't tell you what you needed to report on first contact, I would just give that information. And again, listen to the pilot and see what they're doing. If other pilots are doing it, then maybe err on the side of caution, assume they are getting it right, and you should probably do the same. It's like 5 seconds of phraseology, right? So you don't really harm by offering that information up.
Yeah, and I think also just, as Rob would say, read the room. So if, 3 pilots have checked on and each time the controller has said, please state your position, okay, then maybe I should give that when I check on. And if 3 pilots have checked on with just a SELCAL check and that's it, you're probably in good shape. And the Oceanic Procedures briefing may also provide some guidance. There are some specific sectors that do want more info than others, but for most of us, it's really just going to be that SELCAL check. And Mark Mayo, thanks for watching, by the way. Same question about position reports. That has been done away with. We are not doing position reports, I don't think, in any oceanic sector, certainly not in Gander and in the traditional NAT HLA. As Ben says, it's basically radar in a world where we're using that, much as it's been mostly the case in real life now. So no more position reports, thankfully, which was a disaster anyway, if we're honest. So moving on to the arrivals into Europe and ICAO land. So Simon, question from Jordy. This is also something we talked about with descents earlier, but if I've got a clean speed that's higher than the max holding speed, or ATC gives me a speed restriction and I can't do that, what do I do?
It's a good question, actually, because obviously if you can't, so the first thing is, if ATC asks you to do something that you can't do, whatever it is, then the first thing is to say unable, and ideally tell them why and offer them an alternative. It's good to be helpful in that case rather than just saying nope. So I did see the question about speed, about, what if my clean speed is higher than the maximum holding speed? And so what I would say is, in that case, you have to be a little bit circumspect, because the reason that holding speed exists is going to be to protect the airspace, right? So obviously, the faster you fly, the greater your radius of turn is going to be. So therefore, if you are flying faster than the speed for which the hold was designed, you may find yourself going into airspace which is not allocated to that hold, right? So you might bump into another aeroplane or a mountain, and neither of those things are particularly desirable. So you might need to think about, can you accept that hold? If you can't hold so you might at that speed. So I had a little hunt through some material actually as well. So so for example, the Airbus manuals say that what you should do is if your maximum endurance speed, essentially a clean speed in that case, is less than is greater than the maximum holding speed, it says the crew should select flap 1 and fly S speed, which is the minimum speed with flaps 1. Now, some aircraft might have restrictions on holding in something other than a clean configuration, particularly if there are icing conditions. That may be a problem, because generally speaking, anti-icing systems are less effective when you start getting leading edge devices out and things like that. So in a word, so in summary, it's I would like to think, hopefully, that by the time you've flown all the way across the ocean, that your clean speed is going to hopefully be somewhere within the region that you're going to be able to hold effectively at that. If not, speak to ATC, see if you can negotiate a higher speed. It might be okay. It might not be. Liaise with air traffic basically, and come up with a plan between you is what I would suggest.
Lovely. And I am still here. I'm just dealing with a couple of helping out in the chat, so my disembodied voice will continue to ask questions even though you can't see me. Good question from Aiden came via the FSA Discord. You're landing or setting up to land. Maybe you've been given an approach clearance. You haven't been switched to the tower, so you're getting nervous about whether you're going to get a landing clearance. Do you switch to the tower on your own, or do you wait? And then once you do get to the tower, I mean, how late should you give them before you get your landing clearance, or should you just keep going until they eventually say land or go around?
So I think it's a really good question, especially in the sort of situation that we're likely to encounter during cross the pond. So in theory, you should always get an explicit handover from approach to tower. And that will usually come once you're established on the ILS. And generally speaking, so not, if you've been established a really long way out, sort of, 15, 20 miles, something like that, then the approach controller will generally hang on to you, certainly till you're sort of within 10 miles or so, probably, generally speaking. If you have got comfortably I would say probably comfortably inside 10 miles, let's say, and you're going down the approach and you're sort of 7 or 8 miles out and you still haven't had a handover, I would probably be starting to think maybe they might have forgotten about me at this point. And at that point, I would probably personally take a little bit of a judgment on, can I get, is it practical for me to get a word in edgeways and say, I am still here. Do you want me? Do you still want me, or did you actually want me to be with tower? Or is the frequency rammed? Is the guy kind of, going down the tubes already and in over his head with 8 million aeroplanes? And actually, if I just quietly go over to the tower where they probably thought I was already, is that actually going to be the best thing? So read the room a little bit would be my advice on that. I would expect, generally speaking, you should always expect to get that handover. If it hasn't come and you're probably, I would say, you've been established on the approach for a while, you're within about 7 or 8 miles or something like that, then, if it's really, either give them a nudge, or, if it's really busy and, you're just going to be in the way, you probably, no one's probably going to get too upset if you just quietly go over the tower and give them a nudge. In terms of how late you should wait for that landing clearance, it can come quite late. So in reality, it's I've heard guys get landing clearances almost over the threshold, ideally a little bit earlier than that, but it can come really quite late, really sort of up to and including the threshold. So I would say generally don't be, especially again, right, having that situation awareness, what's going on around you, what is the traffic situation? Can you see the other aircraft ahead of you that is hopefully just about to vacate the runway, kind of thing? I would say generally don't be too trigger happy on that go around. Common misconception is that the minimum the decision height is the point at which you need to have a landing clearance. If you haven't had a landing clearance by the decision height, you need to go around, which is not true. The only thing that is relevant as far as that decision height, decision altitude is concerned is, can I see the runway? So you can continue below that decision height without a landing clearance. How far you go to some extent is a gray area, very much up to you as the you are the captain. So you on your head be it, essentially, to make that judgment call. Again, as I say, as long as if you've kind of got to judge that for yourself in terms of giving it enough time that realistically the aeroplane ahead of you has a chance to get off the runway and you can still get that landing clearance. Obviously, you don't really want to go much beyond, you don't really want to go beyond the landing threshold, for example, without a landing clearance. So, or touchdown. So it's a judgment call, but don't be too trigger happy would be my general advice.
Very good. And I think that's all the questions we have. So super appreciate the time from all three of our experts, Rob, Ben, and Simon, for taking the time to do this, not just this edition, but now for several Across the Ponds in a row. We hope this has been helpful to you. If you'd like to access a copy of the slides we went through, you can find those at the link that you can see on the screen just below me. It's bit.ly/CTP24E. And you can download a copy of all the slides that we've been sharing with you this afternoon. My name is Evan. I'm the co-founder of Flight Simulation Association. We're the folks who put on Flight Sim Expo. We do this kind of content on a regular basis. Coming up in just a couple weekends from us is beta content around what's coming in Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. We've got a bunch of the content creators who are out at that event in Arizona to share their experiences with the sim, share what they've been trying out in the tech alpha, as you've been seeing across the community over the past few days. So feel free to join us for that. That's on October 26th. You can go ahead and scan that QR code if you'd like to get a calendar reminder. Otherwise, I will see you at Cross the Pond on Saturday. Once again, thanks to everybody for being on the screen and on the airwaves with me this evening. Thank you to the audience for the great questions, and we will see you on Saturday for Cross the Pond.